Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. I'm just so excited to be able to interview Vernacchio. He is a sexuality educator, teaches at Friends Central, which is a private Quaker school just outside of Philadelphia. I ran into Al at an ASECT conference where he was one of the keynote speakers and just really made a great impression on me. He had an article in the New York Times Magazine which profiled his class, and he writes a blog, and he has a great book out called For Goodness Sex. Today we're here to talk about educating our teenagers. So welcome, Al, to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Oh, I'm thrilled that you're here. Just so excited. Why don't you give us a little more of your bio than what I just did? Tell us a little about your education and maybe, if you're comfortable, even some of your religious background.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been a human sexuality educator for about 25 years. I do my education almost exclusively in high school with adolescents. I did have a short period in between teaching jobs where I worked as the volunteer coordinator for an AIDS service organization in Philadelphia called Action AIDS. But most of my professional life has been in the classroom. My undergraduate degree is actually in theology. I grew up in a Roman Catholic Italian-American family in Philadelphia. Actually, religion and spirituality has always been a very important foundational pillar in my life. These days, I no longer practice Catholicism. I'm a Quaker, part of the Religious Society of Friends, and I have been worshiping in that manner for many years now. And one of the things I really try to do in my work is make sure that we can create a really strong dialogue between sexuality and religion and spirituality. A lot of people assume they're natural adversaries, but I really think they have much more to say to each other and can be allies so much more than adversaries.
So one of the things that I really liked just right off the bat that was on your book cover, it said, your kids know more about sex than you think they do, but your kids don't know as much about sex as they think they do. So why don't we just start with, what do you think are some of the challenges that we're facing in our sexual education programs, and maybe even explain the difference between what we'd call abstinence-based or abstinence-only sexual education versus a more comprehensive approach?
Sure. I think that a lot of the problems we see in the educational systems around human sexuality are a reflection of some of the problems we have in the larger American society in talking about and dealing with healthy sexuality. We're a country that is not very comfortable talking about sexuality, is not very comfortable thinking about people at any age and stage of life as sexual people. And that silence and that hesitation just breeds mythology and misinformation, and we lose so many important opportunities to have real conversations, especially with young people, but also with each other and with our partners. So education, in terms of classroom education around human sexuality, for such a very long time in America, it has been put in the purview of the health and physical education teachers, because sexuality classes are often put in the health curriculum. And that's perfectly fine. I mean, these are very good, very well-meaning teachers. The problem is they're not trained as sexuality educators. And so we really haven't had a strong tradition in this country of having people who are actually trained in human sexuality education doing that education in classrooms. And that's where I come in, because I am specifically trained to do this work. Basically, in America, there are two sort of poles when you look at sexuality education. On one pole is what's called abstinence only or abstinence only until marriage education. And that is education that has as its primary value the delaying of any sexual activity until marriage. And marriage, usually as defined by a religious institution, not necessarily by a civil institution. That education tends to be very focused on just saying no to sex as a teenager. It can be very focused on hyping up the potential negative consequences of sexual interactions outside of marriage. And it seems to have this belief that marriage somehow conveys automatically everything one needs to have healthy sexuality. On the other pole, you have comprehensive sexuality education. That's what I do. And that is education that does not necessarily, it doesn't actually say when the proper time is for an individual to become sexually active. But what it's interested in doing is making sure people have good, up-to-date scientific information about their bodies, about relationships, about sexual activity, also with teaching a lot of values clarification so that young people and adults can think deeply about what is true for them, how do they want to live their lives, and then be able to have the education, the information, and the skills necessary to live purposeful and meaningful lives when it comes to their sexual selves. I think that very often we run into a very unfortunate situation where comprehensive sex ed people try to demonize abstinence only people and vice versa. And I don't really want to get into that because I don't believe that. I think these are two very different views. I think they both are trying to reach the same goal, which is creating healthy sexuality. I happen to believe one does it better than the other. But I don't think that abstinence in any way is a value that is unrealistic or out of date. I tend personally not to use the word abstinence. I talk about setting sexual limits because unfortunately I think abstinence is a pretty loaded word in a lot of the circles that I travel in. It has a lot of negative connotations, and I don't want to perpetuate that.
Right. So, and how do we define abstinence, which I think is what you're going to
Right.
get at, right? Because I know
Right.
that I often see adolescents where they'll be very proud of their virginity
Hmm.
status, and yet they're being quite sexual in other ways, which, again, is fine, but the way they're coming at it is not necessarily from a place of sexual ownership. They're really just saying, I'm not having vaginal penile sex, therefore I'm okay and everything else goes.
That's right. I find it fascinating to talk to young people about situations like that and sort of hold a mirror up to the way that they are justifying a definition of virginity, for example, when someone has engaged in oral sexual activity or perhaps anal sexual activity, but just because they haven't had penile vaginal sexual intercourse, that's a label they can claim. I talk to kids all the time about why I think that's a problematic approach. And also, I think that we have to be honest about the cultural origins of the definition of virginity and why virginity was seen as a worthwhile or a desired state for women. It's that definition tends to be used in a very sexist way in our culture because women are expected to be virgins and get props for being virgins, but boys don't, and that seems to me really unfair. And it's something that I like to talk about with young people to explore further.
Yeah, that's probably one thing that Mormonism does really well, actually, with both genders, is that really the standards are applied the same.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily we get the same messages. I still think that boys get the message that they are sexual creatures that need to control themselves, and young women get the messages that they better watch out for young boys. So,
Right, and that it really sets up such a bad dynamic for young heterosexual kids who are trying to go out and create healthy relationships. If you're starting from that, offensive defensive assumption, it's very difficult to create a healthy relationship.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about the virginity historicity?
Sure. When we look at the importance of virginity in a historical perspective, we also have to look at marriage and what marriage meant in times before the present time. Not really until the 19th century was marriage the way we think about it today, a union of two people who fall in love and choose to be together. For so many thousands of years, marriage was a business contract between families, and it usually was a business contract between men in families, where women were were used as important tokens of creating unity between families, or but women had an economic interest. Marriage was a business deal. Every father or brother commanded a bridal price to allow his daughter or sister to marry, and if the woman was a virgin, you could get a much better bridal price for her. um, but it really wasn't about her purity. It was about getting a better deal for the man who is seeking a wife, and a better deal for the father and brother who are offering this woman up in marriage. And so when you go back to those origins and you realize a lot of our early focus on virginity was not really about trying to honor the woman, but really trying to create a better economic situation, you begin to see that maybe that's not the way we really want to continue our thinking, or that's not a path that we want to flow from. I actually think virginity is a perfectly lovely and valid way to exist in the world for anyone of any gender or any sexual orientation. But I would like to find a way where we can apply the definition equally to all genders, all sexual orientations, rather than have this artifact that is very sexist and that really isn't about focusing on relationship, but that's really focusing more on economics.
And so, how do you go about proposing a definition, first of all, for virginity, and then maybe tying that into how do we start talking about sexual experiences and being a
Sure.
sexual being from basically birth until death?
Yeah. The way that I do it is I start by talking about the definition of having sex and what that means in our culture. Because still, as we've mentioned before, when most people say they had sex, they're referring to penile vaginal intercourse, or sexual intercourse, as it's often called. And when you start examining that as the definition for having sex, a few things appear rather quickly. One is that it's an entirely mechanical definition. It's simply putting two body parts together. That definition of having sex doesn't say anything about consent. It doesn't say anything about pleasure. It doesn't say anything about mutuality. It doesn't say anything about intimacy or connection. So, one of the things that happens in my line of work is that sometimes a young person will come to me and will very courageously share with me that they're a survivor of sexual abuse or sexual assault earlier in their life. And one of the questions they often have, especially if they're a young woman, is so am I still a virgin or not? And if you're using a definition of virginity based on simply whether someone has penetrated or been penetrated, then the answer would be no. But that's a ridiculous answer in that case, because any sex that is non consensual, I personally can't count as having sex or as losing one's virginity. Also, the definition of having sex the way we have it is heteronormative. So it works for couples who are biologically male and female, but you have to tweak that definition when you start changing the genders of the people involved. And that strikes me as not a good definition if it's not inclusive of all people's experiences. Also, what about people who are heterosexual but who don't use their genitals to have sex? Maybe because of spinal cord injuries, or maybe because of some other way that they exist in the world. So it does seem to me that that our definition of having sex is what we really need to look at, and then that will change our definition of virginity on the back end of that. And when I have those conversations with young people, they're really very interested and surprised and very thoughtful about it. And I think young people really do care about fairness and equity and justice. And when you help them see that something that they just thought they maybe never thought about turns out to be anything but equal, just, and fair, then that really gives them the chance to think and rethink their values and the way they want to look at the world.
So let's talk a little bit about parents. It's pretty normal to be uncomfortable with your kid's sexuality, and yet it's so important at the same time, as you say in your book, to see our children's sexuality as both normal and necessary.
Yeah.
And, coming from the Mormon culture I come from, it seems like, well, we are obviously very abstinence-centered as far as waiting until marriage, which, again, is a fine value to have, like you've pointed out. But I feel like oftentimes the way we go about that, in a sense, creates this expectation that our teenagers in particular are going to be asexual beings.
Right.
That they're not going to entertain sexual thoughts, or that they shouldn't, or that they shouldn't even necessarily do anything sexual, even such simple things that seem pretty normative to the rest of the population, like masturbation or some level of making out or having some type of sexual contact with a partner. And also this idea romantic relationships should be avoided until you're older. So in our culture, we don't date until you're 16, and even then it's encouraged that you group date, maybe not single date till you're 18. And I see this trend to kind of poo-poo or infantilize teenagers' romantic interests, like they're not really real, or they're just puppy love, or you shouldn't have them. And I'm not sure what that does as far as creating good relational dynamics as they're trying to start having those types of experiences in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot I threw out at you. But
Yeah, but it all resonates with me. I think the place where I would start with responding to that is by saying one of the things that can be helpful for parents is to sort of take an assessment of whether, when they think about our human sexuality, when they think about the totality of our bodies, our hearts, our minds, and our spirits, because truly what it means to be a sexual being is not just to be sexually active. It means to have a body, to have a sense of gender identity. It means to move through the world in ways that express who we are. And it means to have sexual and romantic attractions and desires. And those things are with us from our first moments of life all the way through to our final moments of life. And so being a sexual being is not something that just turns on at puberty and then, maybe turns off at some point in later life. It's a birth to death reality. And I think we have to ask the hard question of, when we think about sexuality, do we see it as a force for good in the universe, part of the Creator's plan for bettering the world, or do we see it as something nasty and dangerous and wild forces that need to be controlled? My primary assumption as a sexuality educator is that our sexuality is a good gift from a good God that is given to us so that we can make the world better than we found it. And that can be through lots of ways in my value system. Other people have a more limited value system for how that can happen. So if you start with the fact that sexuality is not something scary or dangerous, but something really normal and actually really good, it makes it easier for us to talk to younger children about their bodies, about the way they're relating to each other, about the way they feel in the world. And it normalizes the fact that getting to know our bodies and being able to explore our bodies through masturbation, for example, it can be really healthy and satisfying and a great way to deal with sexual urges when we are not yet in a place where we can engage in partnered sexual activity. And then I think helping parents to become more comfortable with the idea that What we are doing with children is not keeping sexuality from them or sort of putting it on the top shelf, but we're continually exploring age appropriate ways to deal with the reality that this is a sexual person in front of us, whether they are 2 years old or 10 years old or 21 years old. And so, what is the appropriate way for us to naturally deal with our body sensations, our need to reach out in relationships of some kind to other people, our navigating the world that has a lot of expectations for us about who they think we should be? And I think the most sexually healthy kids that I've met in my career are kids who have been able to have open conversations with their parents all throughout their lives. And whereas those folks who grew up in very silent households or households that had a lot of shame or that didn't see sexuality as a positive force, they have a lot harder time coming into their own sexuality and accepting it as a good gift and all that.
One of the things that I love about Mormon theology is exactly what you're talking about, that sexuality is something that's seen as a force for good, that it is a gift from God. And yet we still have this dichotomy of how we speak about sexuality. It's only a gift from God if it's being done at the right time, at the right place, with the right person, which obviously is in marriage,
Mhm.
and probably ideally a Mormon marriage, that's been through the temple, which is kind of our language.
Mhm.
But then if it's sexuality outside of that, then there's a lot of provocative terminology that's used. You're in the clutches of Satan, or you're being tempted, or the world is not seen as a place where sexuality is safe. So be scared of how the world will tell you about sexuality. And so there is a lot of fear-based, driven rhetoric that, quite frankly, is happening for most of the time that people are getting sexually educated, because most of our sexual education, I believe, is given at a time when most people don't want you to be having sex, which is adolescence. So it's
Right,
not
but
like we have sexual education classes for adults. I mean, you have them, but you have to really
yeah,
look for them. It's not like part of some prescripted plan that we all go through.
right. Yeah, but I think you've named one of the really important things, which is that when people think that what sexuality education means is simply preparation for sexual activity, I think that's a really limited definition of sexuality education. I see sexuality education not as preparation for sexual activity, but as learning to live in the world as a person, as a full human being, a person who has a body, who has emotions, who has a mind, who has a spirit. I say to my students all the time, it's not like you can take your genitals off and leave them at home when you go to school in the morning, and it's not like you can turn off your hormones or your sexual desires during a math test. Like, those things are with us all the time, and it's not as if we can flick some switch in our body and turn it all off. So for me, sexuality education is, how do we deal with those realities in a world that actually may be tempting us at some point to act in ways that might go against values that we were raised with, but giving young people the opportunity to figure out how to do that, to figure out how to identify their values, to figure out how to recognize that being a sexual person does not necessarily mean that I am sexually active all the time. I joke with kids a lot in presentations that I give, and I say, nobody can be sexually active all the time. That's exhausting, and you'd never get your homework done. Um, but I also, the converse of that, and this is something I also say to parents when I speak to them, is I've never met a parent who didn't eventually want their child to be in a satisfying, successful, loving, pleasurable sexual relationship. And so, how do we expect young people to be able to achieve that if we've given them little to no groundwork to set them up for that? And I think that speaks to something that you said earlier, which is, I've met too many teenagers who said to me, the reason that I had had sex or had intercourse with my sweetheart was that I didn't know how else you say I love you. I didn't know how else you show affection. So the more options we can give to young people for expressing passion, intimacy, romance at various ages, the more actually we help delay things like the onset of sexual intercourse, because they have other ways to express those very natural feelings that they're having. And I think that's really important. So, of course, I don't want little kids in grammar school, seventh grade, eighth grade, to be genitally sexually active with anybody. I don't think that's developmentally appropriate. But it is appropriate to hold hands with people and maybe experience your first kiss, or maybe explore touching people's bodies with their clothes on. And so, how do we help young people at every age and stage of their development find out what are the appropriate ways for me to express physically and emotionally and spiritually, if that's part of one's tradition, this sexuality that I live with 24/7?
As we continue to talk in the interview, we'll probably get into more details. So I'm just going to give a little bit of framing for my audience, in the sense that I don't know who's listening and what spectrum they're at necessarily on Mormonism, but I know that we have very little leeway for our kids to be sexually explorative in ways that even outside of intercourse. And so I would just like to challenge that a little bit, in the sense of my experience as a clinician, having worked with many, many adolescents and many people later that tell me about their adolescent experience, is that when we set up a zero end game, you can do nothing or you can do everything once you're married, there's some real issues that come with that.
Sure.
And that my experience has been that either people fail at that, which is pretty common, especially if masturbation is part of that equation, and therefore start feeling badly about themselves, and that oftentimes affects their relationship with God. Or if they're fairly successful at being asexual throughout their teenage years, it can be something that's very difficult to then, quote, turn back on once they are married and want to explore their sexuality, because they've had to really close off a certain part of themselves for a long period of time. So I'm really going to be very open to your suggestions and thoughts, and encourage my listeners to be open as well, even though it may not fit exactly our thoughts about how we might sexually educate our kids. So with that being said, why don't we start with just you sharing with us your experience about what you feel are some of the either messages that you're concerned our kids are getting, or what are they saying about why they're choosing to have or not have sex?
I think there's no doubt that some of the messages that kids are getting today that are not what I would consider healthy messages come from the over-sexualization that we see in media, especially, but also in a lot of our general society. I think that sexualization is evidence of sort of a general unhealthy approach that a lot of our society has to human sexuality. I say in my book, a dear friend of mine said this quote, and I loved it so much that I put it in the book, that she said, Americans are sexually repressed to the point of being sexually obsessed. So we start out with this real fear and shame and negative feeling about sex, and that we shouldn't talk about it and we shouldn't think about it. But the reality is we don't sell toothpaste without using sex. And that sort of bipolar approach to sexuality is really unhealthy, and it results in lots of messages to kids that say that the only way to move forward, to achieve, to succeed, to be accepted is to highlight the sexual aspects of yourself. I think one of the things we have to do as adults who care about kids is to help them become smart consumers of media. So to be able to look at messages from the music videos they're watching, from the TV shows they're watching, from the movies and the magazines, and to be able to ask questions about, like, what is that about? One of the realities is, the media is not really interested in helping us feel good about ourselves as we are, because if they were, then they wouldn't keep trying to tell us all the things that we need to fix ourselves.
Yeah,
There's
especially when it comes to body image.
so much out there, yeah. But kids don't often recognize that. So helping them come to awareness about that. Hey, notice that this message seems to be all about how you actually aren't okay just the way you are. And that's probably not true. You are great just the way you are. That's a really healthy, sexually healthy message that we can be giving to kids. I think one approach to this is just to try to isolate them from all these influences. I don't really think that's an effective or appropriate approach. I want to engage with kids. I want to watch something with a kid and say, tell me what you think about that. Or did you notice the way that men and women are portrayed in this TV show? And what do you think about that? Those are the kind of conversations that I think don't sound like they're sexual conversations, but actually they are paving the way to healthy sexuality.
What that reminds me of is that we sometimes take the pendulum the other way.
Yeah.
And so, like, for example, I'm noticing we're getting really back into this modesty rhetoric in Mormonism. And so it's like, well, cover up the girls, especially, right? That we don't want to be walking pornography, quote unquote, or we're having stricter clothing laws than we did even 20, 30 years ago.
Right. And again, that seems to me to be this approach of, if we deny or cover up or just try to make the problem go away, then we're doing a good job. The reality is that we have bodies and that they are beautiful and they are sexually alluring, and covering them up doesn't necessarily change that fact. It just robs us of the ability to learn how to manage that. And it's also, again, it's no solution that singles out one gender as the cause or the problem can be a valid solution for the goal of healthy sexuality. Every time young women are told that the way they dress is a problem because it's distracting to young men, that's a problematic message on a number of levels. It assumes that men can't control their sexual desires or urges, and they can. It assumes that every man is sexually interested in women, which is not true. It assumes that being beautiful and showing our bodies as the sexual bodies that they are is problematic, and it doesn't have to be. So again, going behind all those quick rules that we can generate and really looking at what's behind this. Is it something that comes from a place of equity and justice and a sense of bettering the world? And I think a lot of times it can deceptively seem like it is, but in my experience, I don't think it actually gets us where we want to go.
Tell us a little bit about what teenagers say themselves about
Sure.
why they are or are not having sex.
Sure. I think that there's a wide variety. So I always hesitate in talking about the typical teenager because I've never met the typical teenager, but I've taught thousands of kids over 25 years or so of doing this. Some of the main reasons why kids initiate sexual activity, and let me say, let's define sexual activity here as genital sexual activity, just for sake of a definition. So not counting kissing or sort of making out or that kind of stuff. I think many reasons why kids tell me they've done that is, one, they feel ready. Two, they feel like it's the best way to express the emotion and the feelings they're having for this other person. Sometimes it's exploration, and that can be healthy. Sometimes it's feeling a lot of pressure, and that can be really unhealthy. The saddest things that I hear sometimes are young people 12th graders, seniors in high school, who say to me, I just have to get this over with because I can't go to college without having had sex. And I think, well, why not? And if at any point your main motivation is, I just want to get this over with, then what is that saying about the meaning you're giving to this and the way you're conceiving of it? There are a gamut of healthy and unhealthy reasons why kids initiate sexual activity. I think what we can do as adults is to really help kids think deliberately about those reasons while they're trying to make those decisions and guide them in saying, okay, so is this a decision that is going to lead you to be the kind of person you want to be, that is going to lead you to the kind of interaction or relationship you want with somebody else, rather than saying, don't do that or wait to do that, or if you do that, you're a bad person. Let's explore the why behind the what. And often when I talk to teenagers like that, they often change their minds and make a different decision, or start to look at it in a different way. And that's growth, and that's education, and that's, I think, what we're looking for.
You did a great TED Talk comparing a lot of this to pizza. Do you want to talk
Yes.
about that?
Sure. So one of the things I noticed pretty early on in my career is that Americans tend to think about sex like baseball. So there's a whole lot of language in English that sounds like it's talking about baseball, but it's really talking about sexual activity. And this baseball model is pretty pervasive. Let me just back up for 1 second and say that this whole premise that I'm talking about now is based on this idea of conceptual model. So conceptual models are things that we aren't necessarily always aware of, but they're models that tell us how to do things. So, for example, each of us learned how to tie our shoes as little kids using some kind of model, right? Some people made the bunny ears, and some people learned about the old man who walks around the corner. But there's a way where you tie your shoe and you do it the same way every time. And you do it because that's the model that you were taught. And it's the same when you get into the shower. The order in which you wash your body comes from someone at some point teaching you this is how you do that. And so there are these automatic models that guide our behavior. And what I realized early in my career was thinking about sex, that there was a model at work that was guiding people's behavior that they weren't always conscious of. And it seemed to be this baseball model, that sexual activity is this kind of competitive game where you sort of move in advancing bases, first base, second base, third base, home run. When you start looking at sex in that way, some really unsettling conclusions happen. Like, you realize that the model is pretty much based on a heterosexual male-female model where the guy is actually playing the game and the girl is the field on which the game is played. And that's pretty awful when you start to realize that. And you realize that the game has to have a winner, and that means it has to have a loser. You realize that the game is always played exactly the same way. There's not a lot of variation that's allowed. So with that conceptual model, it just seemed like kids were, without necessarily knowing it, setting themselves up for a really bad experience. So I thought, well, you can't just say to kids, that's a bad model, don't do it that way. You've got to be able to offer an alternative. And I thought for a long time about a different model that I might use that would create what I consider to be a healthier outcome. And I have to be honest, I don't remember when I hit on pizza as the model, but once I did, I knew that was it. So if you think about sexual activity the way we think about pizza, first of all, when do you have pizza? Well, you have it when you're hungry for it. So rather than baseball, which tells you when there's a game scheduled and you show up to play, pizza is about, I have an internal sense or desire or hunger, and I'm going to choose whether I want to respond to that or not. Baseball has a whole set of rules and expectations and a very standard way to play. Pizza is a very individualized thing. There's all different kinds of pizzas, all different kinds of ways to top it, all different kinds of ways to eat it, and none of those are considered wrong. They're just considered different. The goal of baseball is to, as we said, win the game. The goal of pizza, if there is a goal, is to feel satisfied. And again, that's a very personal decision that's based on a lot of sensory information we get. So at one point, I might feel perfectly satisfied with this much pizza, and at another time, I might need more to feel satisfied. The other thing I love about pizza versus baseball is that when you play baseball and you show up, no one actually sort of talks about the game before it starts. Everybody knows how to play. You just, take your position and play the game. But when you're going to have pizza with somebody, it always starts with a conversation. What do you want? What do you like? You might even negotiate with somebody about that. I think that's such a healthier model for the kind of sexual interactions and relationships that I want young people to have. And again, when you bring people's awareness to this conceptual model that they've been using to frame what sexual activity is like, and then you offer them a different model, you're not saying you have to now think about it like pizza, but you're giving people a choice and you're giving them an opportunity to think about something in a different way, in a way that might, quite frankly, feel so much more natural, feel so much better, healthier to them. So that's what the baseball and pizza thing is about. It's about giving somebody an idea and helping them figure out a different way to conceive of this whole thing we call sexual activity that might result in a more satisfying, healthier outcome for them.
Well, I love your pizza model. I think it's
Thanks.
a great model. So, going back to something that you said that I really loved, looking at our children as developmentally age appropriate places. Maybe in second grade, it's developmentally appropriate to have your first crush, or in seventh grade, it's developmentally appropriate to have your first kiss, or things of that nature. How do you start looking at developmental appropriate sexual behavior as they start entering later adolescence and even single adulthood, so 18, 19,
Sure.
20, college type years, and starting to have conversations about those types of realities that they're facing in accordance kind of to this pizza model?
Sure. Sure. If you think about, if you take it out of human sexuality for a second, and you just think about what is the major psychosocial developmental stage that late adolescents are in. Somebody is 16, 17, 18, into their early 20s. That's really a stage where people are establishing their own sense of identity and independence. It's a time when they are naturally beginning to detach a little bit from family structure and from that sort of nuclear family unit as the main source of values and support and connection. It's when they are beginning to reach out to the world in an independent way with a sense of really searching for purpose, meaning, connection. So if that's what's happening psychosocially, when you move that into the realm of human sexuality, what that means is that it is developmentally appropriate for late adolescents and college age young singles to be practicing lots of different kinds of relationships and interactions with people to figure out what most fits who they authentically are. That doesn't mean that there has to be a lot of sexual experimentation, but I think it does mean we have to allow young people and give them the space to, what I say is, practice relationships. So one of the things we see in high school today that is a trend that I'm not really in favor of is a lot of these sort of quote unquote long-term relationships starting in high school. So people dating the same person all throughout high school or things like that, and I think I would much rather see them be able to know that in early adulthood and late adolescence, what is normal is to be trying out different kinds of relationships and trying out different kinds of ways to be passionate, intimate, even sexual with other people, not for the sake of just hedonism, but for the sake of figuring out what is it that authentically brings me joy, that fills my need for intimacy, that creates the kind of connections that I want, things like that. So again, so what does that mean? It doesn't mean that I think people should be out having sex every night with lots of different people, nor do I think it means that they should be limiting themselves to any one kind of social or sexual interaction. As you can sort of see, it's hard for me to talk about um, big sweeping general rules because we're all so individual, and I want to create space for each person to discover and celebrate their authentic self. One of the things that I say all the time, whether I'm talking to parents or to kids, is when you have that choice of popularity versus authenticity, choosing authenticity is, I would say 99% of the time going to be a much better option ultimately for you. So whenever we create the standard model that every kid has to sort of line up in, that's surely going to be working against the authenticity of somebody or lots of people. Did that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in our culture is that we definitely have one model. And this is how you're a righteous, Mormon teenager or righteous Mormon young adult. And to your point, it's not like getting married automatically gives you healthy sexuality.
Absolutely.
And so we tend to, I think, limit ourselves in our ability to think about what healthy sexuality means and how we incorporate that throughout our lives.
Mm-hmm. There's an amazing TED Talk out there which has nothing to do with human sexuality, but it's called "The Danger of the Single Story," and it's by a young woman from Africa actually who is talking about the way that she was raised with one single story of how the world works and how limiting that turned out to be. And I do believe that any single story necessarily limits who we are and what we need to do.
So you have this great chapter called Creating a Family Philosophy of Sex. So I thought we'd maybe end with some of your thoughts about that. And then if you could also maybe give your top 3 to 5 recommendations of what parents should be discussing with their adolescents.
Sure. So the chapter about creating a family philosophy of sex is really about being deliberate as a parent or a caring adult to help young people explore, first of all, what are the values around sexuality that we as a family operate from, and why is that? And then to help young people begin to examine those values and look at their own lives and look at their own trajectory and goals. And it's an approach that's called value clarification. So rather than saying, these are our rules, this is what we live by, that's it, it's more, these are our rules, this is why we live by that. We think they're a really great way to proceed. But really, they're only going to work if you truly find truth in them and adopt them because you believe they're right for you, not because I said they're right for you. So creating a family philosophy is when kids are little, explaining the rules very clearly and explaining why we have them and really expecting them to abide by those rules and guidelines. But as kids grow, to give them the opportunity to think, to question, to seek truth. And they may very well say, you know what, the values that I was raised with, they are absolutely what I think is the best way for me to live my life. But they also might not. And that's, one of the scary things, I think, for some adults. But I think that's the choice we have to make, that if we really want authenticity, that means that we have to allow people to figure out what truth is. In my religious tradition, in Quakerism, there is a belief that truth is continuously revealed. So it is always possible for any of us at any moment to have an experience of the divine that helps us see something that maybe we didn't see before. And that, I think, is what is developmentally appropriate for older kids in a family, not to abandon values, not to make them monolithic, but to say, let's dialogue about them. And I would say that to your last point, the couple of top things that I would say to parents to help them in navigating through all this with their young people. One thing that's really important is to encourage your hopes and not your fears. So to speak and act from the position of what is it ultimately that I want for this young person, rather than acting from what am I afraid is going to happen right now that's going to damage or get in the way of that. The second point that I would say, and I said it before, but it bears repeating, is to always encourage our young people and ourselves to opt for authenticity over popularity. And another way to say that is to opt for authenticity over any monolithic way of being that we don't necessarily see, hear, or experience as our truth. And the third thing I would say is parents and caring adults, young people really need us. The path to healthy sexuality can be bumpy, and it's really hard for young people to navigate it alone. And if we are not talking to young people about our values and about our hopes and dreams for them and helping them make decisions, plenty of other people are talking to them. So it's really not a matter of if we don't talk to them, they won't hear it. If we don't talk to them, they just won't hear from us. They're going to hear from plenty of other people. And I think what talking means today is not having necessarily a sit-down big family meeting, but lots of little talks, lots of questions and encouraging words and loving thoughts that happen every day in very natural and normal ways, an ongoing conversation about healthy sexuality. And I want to say that I recognize how hard all of those things are. I am not a parent myself, so I can't ever say to parents, I know from my own experience of my children, but I am somebody who deeply cares about young people and more than anything wants to create a world where young people can experience sexuality in a healthy and happy and way that prizes the unique children of God they are. So I want to just say thank you to all the parents who are doing that work and encourage parents and caring adults to keep going and to keep challenging ourselves to find ways to reach out to young people in ways that ultimately serve their authenticity. And I'm really thankful for the chance to talk to you today. It's really been a delight.
I'm just thrilled to have had you on. I think the things that I'm taking away the most is how we can really start focusing on being less behavior oriented and more value oriented, so it's not that, oh, you've done this particular act, or as a parent, I'm freaking out because, I just found out you've been engaged in this particular behavior. It's more about finding that common denominator of what do we want this to be about. And then I think you didn't necessarily use this language, but I think it's implicit in what you're saying is being less punishment oriented, so that we're not going to be punishing our kids for exploring in areas that we're uncomfortable with, and instead increasing dialogue. I think that's very useful, how you come across. I totally recommend your book. I think it's a phenomenally well-written book that really, in many ways, even though you don't come from the Mormon background, is very congruent with that. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to give, or anything I didn't ask that you'd like to talk about? Or
I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I think again, I would just say that ultimately this is about really loving and valuing and respecting young people as unique creatures of God and helping them achieve their healthiest, happiest state they can. And that from my value perspective, that can come in a lot of different forms. But I really believe that we're all working towards the same goal, and I'm happy to be walking this journey alongside of all of you. So thanks.
Thank you, Al, so much for coming on today.
My pleasure.
turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary,
Ordinary.
no, it's extraordinary.